I'm going through the Egyptian works on your list of works for Art History 1. Egypt is in Northeast Africa, and it is one of the two cradles of civilization that we looked at. The first one was Mesopotamia. It is very similar to Mesopotamia in that it is a river, and the river's overflows is alluvial plain, so that it made it possible for people who were previously hunters and gatherers to move into an agricultural society because the land was fertile and you could cultivate lots of food, and you could have populations of, in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. It differs from Mesopotamia in that where Mesopotamia is unprotected, this is protected. The history of Mesopotamia, as we saw, has lots and lots of turnover from one civilization to the next because they couldn't protect themselves with fortresses and so on. And here there are deserts. The Western Desert, as you see, on this side, and the Eastern Desert, and it's blocked on all sides. The sea up here, and there's mountains down here, so that it could enjoy a stable society for a very long time, from about 3000 BC to maybe in the single-digit hundreds BC. It's maybe 300 or so is when it fell to the Greeks. But that's a very long stretch of time for one country to be pretty much continuous. And as we'll see, the art in this civilization has a great deal of continuity. So let's look at it. The first work is called The Palette of King Narmer. A palette, as you know, in painting is a thing you hold in your hand and put paint in it and you paint something. And this is sort of a ceremonial version of such a thing. This little pocket right here on the back side has an indentation where you could put ink, and you could use a paintbrush and take up the ink here and paint things like mascara on eyes or something like that. Or at least that's what I understand this is for in a ceremonial sense. But for our purposes, this is it's just like the victories stela of Naram Sin, in that it has a large number of figures on it, and it tells a story. And in this case, it's almost the same story, where a ruler has conquered a foe, and this commemorates that conquering. But it's much more sophisticated than the other one. The other one just had a warrior, and he's shown as victorious over an army. In this case, Egypt, as we see in the map, the part up here is called Lower Egypt, even though it's in the north, and Upper Egypt's on this side. And these were two different civilizations that are two different separate, divisions of the country. And around 3000 BC, they united. And they united because of this man, Narmer, who led the Upper Egyptians in an army to defeat the Lower, and in doing so, he united the whole country into one. So that's when we think of as the beginning of Egypt as a whole. All right, we're looking at the front and the back, and this would be the front. You see the main figure here is very large, and it's an example of hierarchical scale, just like we saw in the previous example from Mesopotamia. This is a much larger figure in relationship to the others that we saw before. But this is to show that he's the king, and he's represented in a way that's removed from reality a great deal. He's been sort of geometricized. That is, he's turned into a pattern, almost like he's a letter of the alphabet. And as you understand from you're aware of hieroglyphs and Egyptian language being used to have little pictures for words, that these are like letters in an alphabet, and then that in that literal sense. A figure, as we've seen in several instances before, is reduced to a series of shapes, and the shapes are designed so as to show the the ideal or the most representational view of a thing. So a human figure is kind of complex. So one view of one part of the body is not ideal compared to another view. So it's mixed up. You've got a frontal version of the shoulders, profile version of the legs and the hips and the feet. In the face, the eye is frontal, where the face itself is in profile. So this combination of frontal and profile, so as to get the best view, are put together to create this type of figure. It's a little different from the one we saw before. The other one, who sort of the emphasis was on its power and strength. It was very muscular, but this figure is stylized even more removed from reality, for a specific reason. Because he's removed from reality, he's removed from being a normal human being. This is a king, but he has a kind of a godlike status. Like here is a god, Horus, who is doing the same sort of thing that he is doing. So he is behaving almost as if he's a god. And here it is, Horus is holding this rope in what is, instead of being a claw, it's actually an arm. A rope is holding by the nose this stylized version of a head. And the head is attached to this shape, and it's got this papyrus reeds coming out of it. So all of this is the symbol of Lower Egypt. Papyrus reeds grow in the delta. Up here, you can imagine it's kind of swampy, and a bunch of reeds grow, and that's going to be an important thing later. We'll see about papyrus and how the symbols are going to be used in architecture later. But anyway, this is pieces of a person, and these objects and plants are put together to create a symbol, a picture writing symbol, a hieroglyph. And the god here, represented by a hawk, but with a human arm holding this, is illustrating in a literal way what's going on in the picture, which is this the subduing of Lower Egypt by Upper Egypt. And this is one way of representing it. Another way of representing it, it's the king as a human figure, but it's a human figure that's stylized so it's very much removed from normal human figures, and it's very flat and artificial looking. The person here is in the same pose, but proportioned differently. He's standing on a ground line, just like this one here, but it's sort of floating in the air. And he's much smaller, so he's less important, but he's holding, can't see it, are sandals, which are the shoes that belong to the ruler, to the king. Notice he's barefoot because he's standing on holy ground, being a god. He's doing something that is godlike, which is unifying Egypt by doing this. And instead of having Lower Egypt represented by a large number of people, there's one person who represents the entire nation. And he is represented in a way that's less rigid. He seems to be like, kind of limp. And he doesn't follow the same form of the regularity and geometric sized silhouette that the king is. He's a little more irregular. He has some overlapping here. Overlapping apparently is something that mortals have, not immortals. But he's being subjugated. His hair is being held. Here the horse is holding the nose. But in both cases, he's sort of symbolically defeating this enemy. One reason Another reason, to make him look godlike, is representing him this way with these symbols. The symbol of the little tail, the bull's tail here, and the skirt, and the stylized muscles of his leg. All these things are all to remove him from reality, but to make him look, like a pictogram, like a hieroglyph. But he also looks timeless, because he's never going to move. He's forever in this pose, holding the mace up, about to hit this guy. That timelessness is something we're going to see a lot of in Egyptian art, because timelessness means that you're going to have continuity forever. That whatever is happening in the picture is something that happens for all time, and that idea is, you can imagine, as being important to the Egyptians, because they kept their civilization going for all of that time, and it was a huge value to them whenever things got bad, or there was some sort of chaos occurring, or there was one of the few periods that occurred where there was change. They would always revert back to their roots and make everything, try to make everything like it was. And so maintaining continuity is a value to them. So representing timelessness is what their art does, and more so with the figure of the king. You have a different degree of timelessness, I guess, since he's standing there and for all time there's not moving, equal weight here, whereas this guy is not timeless. He's a little wobbly. He has some overlapping here. His leg is not parallel to the floor, and all these things are to indicate that he's not in the same status, same cosmological universe as the main king. Down here below the ground line are a few more of representations of the dead bodies of the subjugated people. There's a little ground plan of a fortress here that was taken. On this side, the back side, the king is represented as a bull, and he's sort of got his head down with his horns, as if he's attacking this shape here, which is another representation of the fortifications in Lower Egypt. But this case, this represents the wall as seen from above. This represents the fortress as seen from the side. So again, changing perspectives, seeing things from multiple points of view, is something that's we're going to see is a common feature in Egyptian art. I would recommend that you look in your book and find out what all these little things mean. There's the defeated foes here with their heads lying down, or the figures are lying down and seen from above, and their heads are between their legs there. This little procession here with all sorts of symbols, and the king, again, larger than everybody else, but in this composition he's smaller than the one in this representation. He's also wearing a crown that represents both Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. More symbols here. You can find out what those mean. The two lion heads are intertwined, showing the combining of the two regions. Okay, let's go on to the next thing, which is going to be the pyramids. Let's just look at how the pyramids evolved. The purpose of the pyramid is a place to bury the dead. And the reason you bury the dead is because in their worldview, there was an afterlife, and in the afterlife was very similar. You were in a state similar to what you had in life. That is, you had your body. You need to have food in the afterlife. You need to have be surrounded yourself with the sort of things that you enjoyed in life, so that they would create a tomb. And this is the old-fashioned kind, before pyramids were invented. A shaft that went deep into the ground, and they would put the coffin here, and they would embalm the body, because you're going to need it later, to try to preserve everything as much as possible. And they put food and other things that the the body would enjoy later. Toys, works of art, beautiful things, tools, whatever you need down here. And they would close it off, and you would have a place up here for the family to come and make sacrifices and stuff for the dead. And this little building that housed it all is called a mastaba. And over time, these things got bigger. And this is an example of a stepped pyramid, which is essentially a mastaba like this, one on top of the other, to make an even bigger version. And you can imagine that over time, after you've made one, a person who has a greater status would say, well, I want to make mine bigger than the one that came previous, and over time, it would just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually you get pyramids. And after some experimentation, they came upon this shape, which is having a square base and equilateral triangles on the faces, and to make it large and perfect. And so you have these things, these are the three main pyramids, the ones at Giza, and the one that's on your list. These are one of the seven wonders of the world. Originally, they were faced with a bright white stone, limestone, I guess, or marble that covered the entire thing, which would make it very bright in the sun. But the marble was stolen over time because it's a lot easier to get it off of here than it is to go quarry new stone. But the mass of it is still there because, what are you going to do? It's never going to move, and it's a lot of trouble to move all these stones. You can look up all the different theories as to how they made the thing, because it's a very difficult problem to solve. These are gigantic, massive things that would have required a lot of labor and a lot of time to make them, and it's not easy to figure out just what method one could use to make such a thing. But anyway, they're interesting in that they have this shape that no other architecture ever use this again. It's just they're unique and perfect geometric shapes that are sitting out there in the desert, strangely arranged. I don't have a picture, but an above picture of all three of them, and to show that they have interesting geometrical relationships to one another. The geometry of the design on the inside is all sorts of interesting things. So they're worth looking at and figuring out just what's going on. They have a false chamber, for example, to discourage thieves, and all sorts of deals that to let air into it from the outside, so you wouldn't have stale air, and you would have also relieving blocks to keep the weight of the stone from up here from crushing small rooms in here. They're just lots of masterful work goes into these things, and they're just very interesting. Let's move on to the representational sculpture of the Old Kingdom. These are Menkaure and his wife. It's a pharaoh from the Old Kingdom. I think he's the one from one of the three pyramids, but I'm not sure about that. You can look it up in your book. This is an interesting representation because this type of figure, it's it's used throughout most of the period. This standing figure with a weight on one leg and one leg stepping forward, the rigid quality, like sort of at attention sort of pose that the figure has, all of these are going to be repeated endlessly throughout thousands of years. And they're going to be influential to the artwork for Greece, as we will see later. And they're going to take this and make it, change it, alter it for their own forms, and it will evolve and change. Whereas in Egypt, it didn't evolve hardly at all. It's got two figures in this case, though oftentimes you'll just see one, and sometimes on gigantic scales. But in this case, this is a little, I think it's a little bigger than life size. It's made out of a stone that's extremely hard and difficult to work. It has a block of stone, which is what it's carved out of, and that block of stone is still visible in the base and in the back. The figures are not carved completely out of it. You can see that the leg that goes forward is still attached to the stone. It's as if they want the timelessness that I've talked about in terms of the way the figure was drawn in that palette. In this three-dimensional version, it's timeless again in that it's made out of a stone that's very, very hard. It's life size. It's in a pose that's very rigid, and it's still attached to the marble, so that it's never going to move. It's not even pretending like it's moving, or that it could ever move, that it could never change from what you see in this pose. This indicates you can see the kind of material it is. It's a I forget what the name of this one is, but it's sort of like diorite or obsidian or something along those lines. This is a false beard, which is a symbol of the pharaoh. Also, the headdress. Or here, let's look at this one. This headdress is what the pharaohs wear. This shape, and the beard is also part of the costume, and the kilt is also part of the costume. But if you notice from the side here, they wanted to make sure that this never broke off, so they kept the stone that backs it and holds it in place. The hands also, if you look at how the hands are represented, they have this thing in them, like as if he's holding something, but it also has the effect of looking like he's attached. His arms are attached to his body, and they're still attached to the stone. And the space between his arms are also, it's never carved through, because they want that impression of it's never going to move. It's never going to change. So he is, beyond. He's like a superhuman kind of thing. But those things being said, look at the face. The face looks much more individualized. It looks like a person. So that's a person is with individual features. Well, that's not a timeless thing. That's a thing that just occurred that one time in this person and will be different in the next person. So just that tiny bit of naturalism, that tiny bit of an individual look is part of it, because you can imagine they could have decided at the beginning to have an idealized pharaoh face, and then you just have that every time. But instead, they wanted it to look like a particular person, so they gave it some features, just the shape of his nose, the width of his nose, the relationship of his mouth to his eyes, all those things, to make it look like that person, at least to some degree, or at least the way that person looked at some portion in his life. He may have lived to 60 or 70 years old, and he wouldn't have looked like this at the time of his death. But this is the way he would look ideally. If you could take nature and make it ideal, this is the result. In this instance, there's also his wife, or one of his wives, also attached to him in a timeless fashion. She, unlike he, is not entirely as timeless, because she has a pose. She has her arm up like here, and then her hand reaching around the back comes out here to touch, to give him a kind of a symbolic embrace. But that in itself is an action, which is something that things do that are not timeless. That is, he's standing forever in this pose like he's a soldier at attention, whereas she is doing something. She's performing an action. So she's a little bit less timeless. So there's a major and minor thing going on. And also, notice how she's represented. She's given much rounderness, to show the contrast between male and female. And her shoulders are rounder. There's less definition in her figure. this arm looks a little like a conical shape rather than his arm seems to have a naturalistic muscularness to it. And as you go down here, you notice that the naturalism that you could see up here isn't continuing down to his legs, or her legs for that matter. Look how thick the ankles are and how oddly, sharp the shin is, and the toes. All these things don't look like they're made by the same artist with the same interest in naturalism as the one that did this part. I mean, these shoulders, they're not photographic looking, but they're certainly much more naturalistic in proportion. You can recognize this as human features compared to this, which seems to be from a different world. And I'm not sure why that is. Well, I mean, one reason that ankles are thick in a statue like this is because the style comes from whenever you had to do this kind of figure independent of a stone, you would want it to not break at the ankles. And if you make a naturalistic image of a human figure out of stone, its weakest part would be where the ankles are, because stone can break, and so they don't want it to break, so they make the ankles thicker. But that doesn't explain just the absence of the same degree of naturalism as you had up there. We will see that particular thing, the square knee, the sharp shin, the thickness of the ankles, is something that the Greeks are going to copy when they have some trading with the Egyptians. They see these kinds of figures, and they copy some aspects of it for their society, and that'll be a link between two different societies that will become one of those historical relations you might encounter on your test. So let's move forward. Also in the Old Kingdom, this is the seated scribe. It's made of limestone and it's painted. It also has, let's look at a close-up. His eyes are made of different materials than the stone. This is probably ivory, and this might be some sort of glass or opal or something to represent the pupils of the eye. And it's very naturalistic. In fact, it looks like a real person. It looks like the way eyes look, where light changes as it goes through eyes, and it looks like he's looking at you. Another thing is that he doesn't have that rigidity, or at least the same rigidity. He doesn't look as timeless as the pharaoh, and also he's not as perfect. He looks kind of flabby. So there's reasons for these things. He's sitting, which is a less, the status of sitting is less than standing at attention like a soldier. And so there are several things that indicate his degree of status in a society that has a hierarchy that's very high with the pharaoh at the top and his ministers next in line. I guess priests and things are also very high at the top, and then his family, different closer relationships have different degrees of statuses. And as you get farther and farther down, a scribe would be much lower than the pharaoh, but much higher than a regular person. A regular person being the masses of people who just do their daily life, probably artisans and laborers of one kind or another. Those people would be represented in a different way. This one is represented this way, and we saw how the pharaoh was represented. And what you see, the difference in the ways people are represented, is that the more artificial you look, the more timeless you look, the higher your status. So this person, I guess, would be in the middle. He is a scribe. That his job is to write in a time when everybody doesn't write. Only a few specialists would write, and he would be somebody who, I guess, lived in the palace, and whenever a document needed to be written, histories or legal documents or whatever else that needed to be written, his job would be to write it down. You see him sitting. All he's wearing is this sort of skirt thing. He has a scroll of papyrus in his hand. You can see a little more here. His hand used to have um, a, a pencil in it, or a pen that he was writing with, and he's in this pose. Remember, the Menkaure's wife was in a pose that was the kind of pose where you're in an action. He's doing something. So that in itself is a little bit less status than when you're not doing something. But he's doing it in such a way that he's he's symmetrical. He's balanced. He's sort of at attention, even though he's sitting. Um, so all of these are things that give him more status. The thing that's giving him less status is the fact that he's a scribe and he's sitting. The things that give him more status is the fact that of people who might be sitting, he's sitting in a frontal, rigid way. But not as rigid as Menkaure was. He's not attached to stone. He's got spaces where his between his arm and his torso. Why is he flabby? Well, in a world where some people work outside, some people do hard labor outside, those people are going to be very lean. People who work inside, where it's cooler, and do have a sedentary lifestyle, well, they will have a higher status, and they won't, because they're not doing labor as much. They'll get flabby, and in this sense, flabbiness is a sign of higher status. So why is he painted? Why isn't he the color of limestone? Well, there's a history behind that. Most sculpture, before the Italian Renaissance, most sculpture was painted, going back to the Egyptians. But the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, medieval sculpture was painted. And after time, the paint wears off, and they don't repaint them. So most of the sculpture that has survived has lost its paint. In the Renaissance, when people discovered sculpture that had been made in the ancient times, the paint had worn off, and they just assumed that it never had paint. So when they started making sculpture, they made it without paint, without painting it. Most of the time, and most of the sculpture since then has been made without paint, because that's the way they thought it was in the ancient time, and what they were trying to do is bring back the ancient techniques. And it wasn't until relatively recently that it was discovered that the ancient art had paint. So there you have it, the seated scribe. He looks like an individual person. He has things to make him look even more real. Looking like a real person with individualized features. Notice doesn't have quite exact symmetry in his face, and lots of attention has been made him to look like a real living person. That, although higher status than a laborer, is a lower status thing compared to the pharaoh, who is trying to be made into something godlike. Okay. Moving on to the hippopotamus hunt. This is a wall. It's a painting, but it's also a relief sculpture. The walls of tombs were decorated with all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's just acres and acres of wall surfaces that are painted or sculpted, depending on the status of the person in it. Many people in the society had tombs. I mean, maybe not the regular everyday laborers, but if you had any kind of wealth at all, you would have a tomb. And the higher of wealth you have, the more sophisticated, the more expensive stuff you would have on your wall. This guy, I think his name is T-E, and he is represented standing on a boat. His method of representation is very similar to the kind that was of the King Narmer. That is, the frontal shoulders, profile face, frontal eye, profile everything else, with this kilt that he's wearing. All these things indicate that he's very high status. He's like a letter in an alphabet. He's so artificial looking. And also he's higher in scale than these other people who are, I guess, his servants, whose job it is to man the boats and hunt the hippopotamuses, who are in a river, the River Nile, and they're underwater and with other fish down here. Apparently this is an activity that this person enjoyed in life, and in his afterlife he wants to enjoy it again, so he has pictures of him doing it. The representation of him is different than the people who are doing stuff. They're doing an action, whereas he's standing in a timeless manner. Their action means that we can see just what they're doing because their poses are individualized and they're specific to what they're doing. The person with the pole here, the person with the lines, the person with the spears, whoever's guiding the boat. I mean, each one has a pose that's specific to what they're doing, and they're caught in a moment of time. Whereas he's not doing anything other than just standing there, holding the stick, being timeless. So you can see how representation goes with status. When the Egyptians wanted to, they could represent things very naturalistically. This is not a very high resolution picture, but you can see that the fish here are, underwater, and you can see, the way this convention of depiction is such that water is represented by these little squiggly lines, and it's underneath the boat, but we can see it here because it's like a cutaway view. But we have all these silhouettes of fish, and all these fish are identifiable fish, and they have scales and they have all the details, so as to you could recognize them all, assuming you knew those. And the hippopotami, and the crocodile here. They are represented doing the sort of things that those animals do. They're underwater, and they're actually very dangerous. If you know anything about hippopotamuses, they're like the most dangerous animals in Africa. They kill more people than the lions and whatnot that are the big predators. Anyway, the background is represented by these vertical grooves, which are kind of neat because they make a nice pattern in the background. And if you watch as you go up, you'll notice these grooves, like this one, for example, goes and grows into a plant. This is a papyrus stalk with a bud of a papyrus, whatever the bud is, like with a flower at the end of it. And you say that they all do that. Like this one here is going up into another thing there. And so you'll see the difference between the bud version of this papyrus flower and the bell shape of the flower itself. We'll see those later in architecture, because in architecture they'll use this bud shape for one kind of column top, the capital, and this kind for another kind. All right. There's also other stuff going on in here. There's these animals that are sort of like jackals or maybe lemurs or something that are climbing up into the reeds to get at these chicks. Some sort of water birds that live in the papyrus and build their nest in the papyrus are being threatened by these animals. This is a nice naturalistic observation of nature thing going on here, so that we can see all the stuff that's going on. See all the attention to detail of the behavior of little chicks, and the behavior of the parents of the chicks defending them. All the different poses. You can see that they really looked at nature and really copied as close as they could the behavior of these animals, which is kind of neat, because artists who do this, you would think, well, they're not looking at nature at all. They're just copying a pattern, just like someone copying the letter A, and making it just like the letter A, and you can't deviate from it, because otherwise it wouldn't be recognized as the letter A, and this is not an example of naturalism here. But when they want to do naturalism, they're perfectly capable of it, and this isn't even the most detailed version of such a thing. They do this all the time. It's a very common thing. But when they do it, they want to do it for certain reasons. Different. If they have a reason to do nature, They'll look at nature and copy it exactly. And when they want to make something artificial for status purposes, they'll do that too. All right, that's all we have for the Old Kingdom. The whole Egyptian period is divided into three pieces: the Old, the New, and a Middle Kingdom, and they are separated by these periods of chaos, sometimes like as much as 100 years long. That they had these periods of chaos where the old regime, for whatever reason, was toppled, and they didn't have leaders for a long time, and it took a while to get back under their feet again. And when they did, they started the New Kingdom, which or a New Kingdom. This is what's called the Middle one, and we only have two works from the Middle Kingdom. And the reason why is that, there's not that it's not as long as the Old Kingdom, and the Old Kingdom has good works that are representing the whole. But here, this is the head of one of the rulers from this period. His name is Senusret III, and he looks like he's represented much like Menkaure was in terms of just his head, and he has the what do you call it, the headscarf thing. He has a little cobra up here, which is symbol of his being the pharaoh. But there's some things about his face that are different. He's not just individualized. Let's lay aside the fact that it's broken in many places, but there's enough of the original that's left here to indicate that there's more than just individualized features. The naturalism here is much greater. In fact, that you can see the age of the person. He has a little puffiness right under his eyes, and a little bit of brow, like his knitted brows a little bit, and these lines here, the cheekbone being pressed through here. There's a little bit of, like he's a little bit careworn, which is something that is not something you would ever see in the Old Kingdom. Old Kingdom, the faces, even though they're individualized, are idealized to the point where you don't have any, human characteristic like sagging, baggy eyes and stuff. And I don't think this is because this guy just happened to have that and they wanted to, since he has it, we'll represent it. It's like there's a kind of a change in perception, almost as if they, by this point, by the point of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt has been around for over 1,000 years. And I think the characteristics that you see here in the face are a kind of a concession to the natural world, that people do get old, but there's something about that oldness that is a kind of a status symbol that you don't have to an idealized youthful ruler. When you have an older ruler like this, with a little bit of bags under the eyes and knit, he looks more serious, more wise, as a result of having been through a lot, and that in itself is a different measure of status than you had before. It's not much different, and many of the features that you see here are represented in Old Kingdom sculptures, thousands and thousands of times. But just this little feature, this little bit of naturalism here is new for this period. Let's look at this work too. This is also a Middle Kingdom. It's a stele, but it's a big, just a stone that marks and as records a kind of a history, and it's in a tomb by somebody whose name is Usuver, and he was a sculptor, and it may be that he sculpted his own tomb. You may wonder, it takes a long time to make artwork in a tomb. And since people don't usually know when they're going to die, how do they know when to start making the artwork for their tomb? What if someone died early? You would have a tomb that wasn't finished, and what do? You keep working on it? No. As soon as somebody dies, they put them in the tomb, and whatever state the work is in, the artwork is in, they leave it there, and that'll be finished. And this is one that is unfinished. You'll see this stuff down here. I have a closer view of it. this part. This is unfinished. It still has a grid line on it to indicate where they were just drawing the picture onto this surface. What we see up here are hieroglyphics. You may have seen these before. This is what Egyptian writing looks like. It is little pictures that represent words, and if you knew the words, you could read it. And it would tell the history of this family and things like, explaining what these pictures are. There's, the person who's buried there and his wife, and maybe this is his brother or his father or grandfather or other people, and these are sacrificial pieces of animals. We saw examples of this in that Sumerian bull's head thing. It had pieces of animals that represent sacrifices. So there's some sort of history, some story going on that's making some sense to people who can read this. But down here, there's these figures, and the way this works is that they would draw it on there, and then they would carve it, with tools, hammer and chisel, and carve out these shapes and smooth them up and make them look nice, so that when light rakes across them, you can see the shapes. But down here, it's not completely carved. Some of them are carved and some of them aren't. But the thing is, this indicates how they made it. The process of making one of these things, is that they use a grid. Here's an example. This is making a design using a grid. This is something from, I don't know, maybe the early 1900s, where they, how the letter B is constructed using a grid, where, the different parts of the letter, the vertical line is aligned to one of the pieces of the grid, and this one is to another one, and the extent of the round parts and the center of the thing are all related to the grid in some way. So the grid provides a compositional thing for a shape. Well, that's what's going on here. The grid is providing a compositional, a structure. So if you're going to draw a figure, you already have the shape of the figure. It's always going to be profile shoulders and all that. The frontal shoulders and profile hips, all those things. But the size of things, the proportions of things, are governed by this grid. You can see that the arm is one grid line or grid spacing apart, and the number of lines that you get where where the skirt is, where the hand is, and where the shoulders are, and the width of where the eye goes. All these things are governed by this geometric process. So that's an interesting thing to see. I mean, you don't get that in many of the other works of art. You just see the finished thing. But here you see the process of making it. All right, so those two examples that I gave you are Middle Kingdom things. The New Kingdom, we're going to see, at first we're going to have an example of architecture. They stopped making pyramids. Pyramids I think are all Old Kingdom things. In the New Kingdom, they have this kind of complex, big temple complexes that took hundreds and hundreds of years to make, and they would evolve. And this is one called the Temple of Amun, with a big processional way that would come through here, where they would have a large number of people, have some sort of ceremonial parade that goes through this gateway here, and it would go through this gateway and then this gateway. Notice that they get a little bit smaller as you go through, and I think what happens is that the number of people in the procession gets smaller as you go through. You have to be, have a certain degree of status, or be a special person to be able to go through one of these gates, and then as you go through here, it gets more and more exclusive, and as you get further and further, it gets smaller, and maybe there's some point where only the pharaoh can go in, or maybe the high priest can go in, the Holy of Holies. But the thing we're going to be looking at is this building here. This is not anything like the pyramids, in that it's not a tomb. This is a working temple, and it has its purposes for the religion. But as far as architecture is concerned, how you build something, That's what we're interested in here, because this is something where we want to see how they do this kind of thing. This is a large area that's filled with a forest of columns. Inside this part is just lots and lots and lots of columns that are holding up this roof. This is what the columns look like now, and they're still there. They're in rows, and sort of like a grid on the floor, I imagine, was used to place all these columns. And they're gigantic. And I don't even know how you begin to place them there. They're made out of great big blocks of stones that were carved in place. Like they would make a big stack of rectangular stones and then carve round pillars out of them, and they would put hieroglyphs on them and tell stories and do whatever it is you do with hieroglyphs. Here's an example. This looks like a wasp of some sort. The Ankh symbol, cartouches. All these things are designed for, they're communicating something with the surface, but they're also communicating something with the size. It is enormously powerful and lots of grandeur in something this big. Right now you can see it with the sky up here, but it would be closed in. This would be a dark place with a ceiling made out of stone. Notice that we have a post and lintel system like we saw in Stonehenge. But in this case, they're much bigger, taller posts. And the lintels are these things going over here. You can see their proportions of those, that they're designed such a way that they're not going to break right in the middle here. You need to have a big piece of stone over here and just a tiny little gap between one column and another in order to hold them up. And then on top of that would be other things up there, so that then they would be completely closed in. They would get smaller and smaller, skinnier pieces of stone until you completely covered the whole thing. And let's look at the picture. They would be like up here. There would be little vents where light could come in, and those vents were carved out into the stone. So the reason you want all the things to be made of stone is because you want it to be timeless and never rot. For example, you could have this covered with wood. I don't know where you're going to get the wood, because it's wood about as precious as gold in Egypt, because they didn't have much of it. But if you did use wood up here, it would rot. Even if it lasted 500 years, that's nothing. I mean, this is a civilization that lasts thousands of years. So if you want something to last, you make it out of stone. Of course, they've had earthquakes, and it's no longer, the ceiling is no longer there, but it probably lasted a very long time to keep it. Let's look at the capitals of these things. They have let's see, example here. All right, this type of capital is designed to look like the bud of a papyrus. Why would you look like a bud of a papyrus? Well, and this is the flower of the papyrus. This shape here. So you have the bud and the flower represented in the architecture. It's because originally, in the old days before they had stone architecture in Egypt, they would make architecture out of the reeds of the Nile, and they would bundle them up, a bunch of reeds together, and tie them up into these cylindrical shapes, and that is the precursors of columns. And they would have those to hold up the roof, and the roof would be made of wood, and or other bundles of reeds. And because they're originally made out of reeds, the reed form is what they're still thinking, even though they're made of stone. And having the big buds up here are sort of a holdover of that time. Now, a bundle of reeds are not going to be perfectly cylindrical. They would have lots of vertical lines, and there are examples of these columns where there are vertical lines in them. And when the Greeks and the Romans started to make their columns, which are evolved from these. A lot of times they would use those what's called flutes, those little vertical grooves. I think you saw it in the Arch of Constantine had them. Those hark back to that time when columns were made out of bundles of reeds. All right, so this is it's called the Temple of Karnak, is the one that's in your list. And it's a magnificent thing, gigantic stone pillars. And if you're interested, you might want to consider, well, how do you make such a thing? How do you stack all these things up? What if one fell over, and hit the other ones and knocked it down like dominoes? How do you do something like this? It's almost as difficult to imagine how they did this as making the pyramids. So what does their sculpture look like? Well, we have something that strangely occurs in a very short window of time. It's called the Amarna period. This ruler, Akhenaten, is a ruler who came to power in the New Kingdom, and he did something odd in that he wanted to, I guess, change the power structure that was going between the pharaohs and the priests, and he wanted to just eliminate all of the gods that they had before and just have one god, and that one god he would be representing, and so he created new temples, and they got this new style derived from the old style, but exaggerated in weird ways. And this new style is called the Amarna style because I think he created some new place called Amarni, and that's a place where that has lots of examples of this style. It only lasted through his lifetime and a little bit into his son's lifetime, who would be King Tut. And then they reverted back after he died. He reverted back to the old style. And so everything after that is pretty normal, at least, in Egyptian standards. So in this weird period, they had figures like this, where they would have a male figure. His face would be elongated. His eyes would be stretched out like this and slanted. His lips would be really, really wide, but his face is narrow, and these little lines here on his face. His waist is almost like a feminine waist, a little pot belly, and hips sort of almost like feminine hips. Odd. But it was just a different aesthetic, and I guess it was designed to look different than the works before. Here's another version of that sort of thing. You can see how this is not quite as exaggerated as the other one. But still, the proportions of the figure, the proportions of the face, was just like a different set of artificialities for the figure. Some people suggest that, well, maybe due to inbreeding, they had these really distorted, mutated people that these are accurate representations of, which I guess is a possibility. But it also is maybe they wanted something different, and this is what they came up with, and for whatever reason, and this is just a exaggerated version of it. So this work here that we have that is in this style is just this stone sort of tablet looking thing, and it represents the king here. I think it's Akhenaten, and his family. This is his queen, and this is his children. I think he has two little girls here, and there's another little girl here, and they are, sitting, looking at each other, and they're playing with their kids. Like here, you see the father is holding his daughter, who has this weird little watermelon head kind of shape, but that's just part of the style. See the little belly and all those features were in that first thing that I showed you, though this is a smaller, rougher version of it. He's just giving her a kiss and being playful, something you would never think of the rulers of the old kingdom ever doing, or at least being represented doing. Nefertiti there with her her children, and they're this one is facing one way and pointing, but her head is turned looking back at her mother, and this one seems to be like trying to get her mother's attention. I mean, this is what children do, and it comes from, it is a naturalistic representation of behavior, but the style is very unnaturalistic and this weird new style in a world where things are normally timeless. You know, this having Nefertiti's face in this profile with the frontal eye. You know, this harks back to the Old Kingdom, but this particular set of proportions is weird. The lips, the skinniness of the neck, and the spindly arms, and all these other things. The fact that they're sitting and there's this roundness here. It doesn't have the geometry that you expect from Old Kingdom representation. The cushion is coming down. All these things are just weird for this period. And I guess, I mean, this is just a lesson then that you can't go these thousands of years without doing any kind of change. But whatever reason they had for doing this change, it was very short-lived, and they reverted back afterwards. Okay, here's another version of it, another picture of it. And then we have this, which is from this period. It's the same sort of thing, but it's a much more attractive piece. It's the head of Nefertiti, the queen in that last work. It is a head made of limestone, and this work is one of those things that's used for, it's a model. That is, whoever carved it in such a way so as to be the representational work that anytime you needed to carve her head in the future, they would use this as a model rather than having to, get the queen and have her pose or something every time you needed a sculpture. It's a beautiful piece. The design of it is wonderful. It's life size, though in terms of naturalism, it has individualized facial features, but it also has this really elongated neck, which is the only real oddly distorted thing about it. Otherwise, it's very natural. In fact, do I have a? Yeah, I have a. Notice her eye is missing on this side, or at least whatever was used to the inlay for the representing where her iris goes, just like that seated scribe. But look at those faces. I mean, this face. I mean, it looks like a modern day model face from the cover of Vogue or something. The proportions of the face are almost identical to the proportions of faces of ideal female faces from the 20th century. Look at the shape of the hat or the headdress for the representing the queen. How it blends into her head and creates this wonderful counterbalance to the right-leaning face here going this way, and the left-leaning part out here, so that it looks like to keep it from tipping over. The balance pushes this off to the left so as to balance off the rightward thing. And it was painted. It's made out of limestone, but it's covered with stucco, which is a kind of like plaster. And one of the things that it says in your book is that underneath this, the limestone has a different look. That is, they can, I guess they put it in an MRI machine or something. We could see through the plaster and see it down to the limestone. The facial features are actually much more naturalistic, much more look like an individualized person in the carving of the stone. But the plaster on top of that has been used to idealize the figure. Like I think she had more of a bump in her nose, and I guess some other features that were a little bit less than ideal that were represented perfectly in the stone, but covered up so as to make her look like a more timeless thing. Well, here's an oddly funny, similar shaped thing. There's a light in front of the business building that I saw, reminded me for some reason of this. So anyway, her son is King Tut. King Tut's tomb was in a place called the Valley of the Kings. It was, since they had stopped using the pyramids, which are a big sign that, lots and lots of gold is here. They decided, we're tired of people stealing this, robbing these graves, so we'll hide them. And so they found places in the Valley of the Kings to hide tombs. And this one was hidden up until early 1900s, 1920s, I think it was. They found this tomb, and it was completely unmolested. That is, they opened up a tomb and found things exactly as they had been left when King Tut died. I think it was 200 pounds of gold was in it. So even though he's a king that didn't live very long and who was not particularly important, he had an enormous amount of treasure buried with him. And this is his grave mask. This would be the thing put over his mummified body. Right here, underneath here would be his actual head and shoulders of the mummy, and this is his mask. This thing would have been put inside a coffin, and that coffin was inside another coffin. And I think that one was inside another, so you had 3 nested coffins with this inside. And when this was made, it was a thing that was made to never be seen again by any human being. This is just for him in his afterlife. All of this effort, all the artwork that you see in all of the things that were left in his tomb, and you look in your book, you'll see other examples of things. It was a huge number of objects that were put in his tomb. They're just for his use, with the belief that in the afterlife he was going to need all these things and wanted to have to live as luxurious a life as he lived in his actual life. So this is what gold looks like. This is made out of cast gold, and then it's burnished and looking fine, and it's got these materials. I guess some sort of blue is some sort of enamel thing, and there's also, this is lapis. This is the kind of stuff that was in the beard of that bullhead lyre that we saw. The same sort of material. And other things made of glass and other, I guess, rubies or some other precious or semi-precious stones that fill this thing, and it's just a grand bit of workmanship. Here's another picture of the same thing. You notice it looks very different, this one and this one. It's because the gold is like a mirror surface, and a mirror reflects whatever's in the room. So depending how you take the picture, what sort of circumstances are around, it will be reflected in the photograph. So this is what gold would look like in the context of however this was taken. This is probably taken in the museum with all the reflections of all the world around it. And it is just as grand as it can be. Notice that now we can see the face. It has some of those features of the Amarna period, the really wide lips and the elongated neck. But otherwise, he's very naturalistic in that it looks like a young man. I think he was a teenager when he died. And it has all the accoutrements of a pharaoh with the headdress and the cobras and everything. But this, because it's made out of made of gold, it can be made into, it's a softer thing. It doesn't have that same look that obsidian or the really hard stones would have. Also, they probably didn't have time to make it, given that it needed to, he died unexpectedly at a young age, and they didn't have all this stuff made. But anyway, this is this style, and you could compare this, if you had occasion to that head of an Akkadian ruler. They're both made of metal, and they're both heads, but that one has a look to it different from this one, and then as we go on, we'll see other things that you can compare things to, and I'll give examples of how you go about comparing. All right, look, this last work is also from the New Kingdom. This is Ramses. It is a ruler who wanted to show off his power. in the southern part of Egypt, where they had been attacked from tribes and things from farther south, and they had this area of the Nile. We can go back to the thing way down in here. Let's see, where is it? Down in here. This is it, the Temple of Ramses. Way in the southern part, they wanted to protect this area. They wanted to make something in this area to make sure that anybody trying to attack them from the south would understand that don't attack us because we are very, very big and powerful. And how big and powerful? Well, we got this gigantic ruler, and he's represented 4 times in this temple front, and it's carved right out of the mountain. There's the mountain here, and it's just carved right out of it. Like we have the resources to do this, so we are big and powerful. Now, there's something odd about this one that you probably never see again in any circumstance, because this temple has been moved. At the southern end of the Nile, at some point in the, I forget when, in the early 1900s, I guess, they decided to make a dam. It was necessary to control the water flooding of the Nile, so they built a dam in the Aswan, and it flooded where this temple was, and this is a model to show that this is where the temple was, and because they knew that it was going to flood and cover this up, they decided to dismantle this and rebuild it here, so that it would be outside of the water. You could still exist and see it, but you can also have the dam and the water and all the benefits that it was going to bring to everybody to have the dam. So I don't know any other circumstance where you would need to do that, but it happened here. And I guess this is the after moving it look of the thing. But this was, you can see that the scale is gigantic. And just like the Karnak temple and the pyramids, whenever they want to do something on a big scale to impress people, so as to not be messed with, they could do it, and they could make these things of gigantic scale, things that look timeless. I mean, imagine how timeless something is that's still attached to the mountain it was carved out of. It also has this interior space here, which is aligned to the rising sun at a particular day in the year. I think it's his birthday or something, and at one day of the year, the sun will shine all the way down to his statue in the back over there. There's a little bit of relief sculpture here that one of these things is broken, probably as a result of an earthquake or something, but mostly is intact, and you can still see the massiveness and the power that's being represented. Now, other cultures will represent their ruler in a way that is intimidating to show power, but I don't know any that is as successful as this. I think that'll end this our foray into Egypt.